The journal buried under the rubble. The cover was burned, the pages torn, but his handwriting survived. I wish I could tell you I meant to read it, but the words pulled me in like a whisper I couldn't to ignore. It was the smell that always got to me first. Not the sharp, metallic tang of blood, though there was plenty of that, but the deep, heavy smell of chalk dust mixing with iodine and stale smoke. This place, this shell of a building we called Ward C, had once been a schoolhouse in what felt like the middle of nowhere, halfway between the front line and somewhere safe. Now the roof was mostly gone, letting in slices of cold, weak sunlight that only highlighted how much work we had left to do. My name is Sarah Collins, and I was, quite officially, an American Army nurse. But here, amidst the crumbling plaster and the low groans, I felt less like a professional healthcare worker and more like a keeper of broken promises and half-finished lives. It was late October of 1944, and the rhythm of life here wasn't measured in hours, but in the arrival and departure of ambulances. We knew the sounds well, the distant rumble of shelling that told us something terrible was happening miles away, and the closer, rattling approach of the vehicles that meant the terrible had arrived at our door. We were always tired, the kind of bone-deep exhaustion that sits in your shoulders and never quite leaves, even after a 12-hour shift. I was assigned to the triage area yesterday, helping clear out a large section that had been damaged in a smaller, opportunistic raid a few weeks back. We needed space. We always needed more space. Corporal Jenks, a kind but perpetually nervous man, was chipping away at a pile of plaster and splintered wood near what must have been the teacher's desk. I was sweeping up the smaller debris, the dust motes dancing in those beams of weak autumn sun. That's when I saw the boot. It was half buried, a dark leather outline amidst the white-gray rubble. My heart gave that familiar, hard thud against my ribs. Every time we cleared a new section, there was always that chance, that awful, sinking possibility that we would find someone missed. We dug quickly, silently. It wasn't a body, thank God. It was a man, barely alive, tucked into a niche beneath what must have been a staircase that had collapsed inward. He was young, maybe 21, covered in dust and dried mud. We worked him free, and while Corporal Jenks stabilized him on a stretcher, I quickly scanned the area for anything that might identify him or belong to him. That's when my fingers brushed against the leather. It was a small, cloth-bound book, tucked right against his chest pocket. It looked less like official documentation and more like a personal treasure. The binding was scorched, almost black in places, and a few of the outer pages were stuck together by something reddish-brown that I didn't want to think about. I slipped it into the large pocket of my skirt, feeling the weight of it, the heavy responsibility of private property. We had procedures, of course. Everything found had to be logged, categorized, and stored. But something about the way he clutched at the air as we moved him, a young man with fair hair and eyes closed tight, against the world, made me keep the book for just a little longer. I felt a sudden, fierce need to know who he was beyond the tag around his neck. His name was Private Thomas Miller. He had a severe concussion and shrapnel wounds across his back and shoulder. Stable, the doctor said, but out cold a deep, protective unconsciousness that often followed extreme shock. He was placed on a cot in my section of Ward C, near the back wall, where the draft wasn't quite so terrible. I checked on Private Miller hourly, adjusting the thin blanket, monitoring his breathing, noting the small, rhythmic hitch in his chest. It wasn't until midnight, during the lull between shifts, when the only sounds were the soft sizzle of the kerosene lamp and the faraway drip of water from the broken gutter, that I remembered the book. I pulled it out. The cloth was stiff with age and smoke. I knew I shouldn't. Reading a soldier's diary, a person's most private thoughts, was an intrusion, a violation. But Private Miller was silent, his story locked behind closed eyes. And I was tired of only seeing the wounds and the paperwork. I wanted the man. I wanted the context. I opened it carefully, separating the scorched pages. The first entry was dated almost 7 months ago, written with a steady hand that looked surprisingly educated for a soldier who had just barely reached voting age. March 14th, 1944. It snowed today. Even in March, a dirty kind of snow that melts the second it hits the deck, but it's still snow. We've been aboard this troop transport for 3 days now, and the monotony is starting to feel like a pressure in my chest. I keep looking at the horizon, but it's the same endless gray water. Sergeant Reynolds tried to start a card game, but nobody had the heart for it. Everyone is just thinking about the other side, that vast, silent, frightening place where we are headed. I miss the smell of Margot's kitchen. Not the food necessarily, but the cinnamon and the steam from the kettle. It's such a tiny, irrelevant memory, but it's the only thing keeping the salt spray and the diesel fumes out of my head right now. She packed me those 2 hard candies, the ones wrapped in yellow paper. I still have one. I'm saving it for when I see land again, for when this monstrous trip is finally over. I paused, tracing the line of the man's neat script. Margot. The name hung in the damp air of the makeshift ward. This was his life before the dust and the pain, a world of troopships and cinnamon. I glanced over at Private Miller. Even asleep, his face held a certain tension, a youthful structure strained by experience. He looked nothing like the confident writer of that first entry. The war had already begun carving its history onto his features. I turned the page. The paper felt thin and fragile, like dry leaves. March 20th, 1944. We landed in England today. Fog, always fog. It's beautiful, though. Everything is older than dirt, and the grass is impossibly green. The people here look tired, too. They wave and smile, but their eyes are guarded. We're housed in temporary barracks near a place called Andover. Training is relentless. We march until our feet bleed, and then we march some more. I'm realizing that every moment from now on is leading up to one singular, explosive moment. That big thing we all know is coming. Last night I dreamed of the lake back home. Not the summer lake, full of shouting kids and sunshine, but the lake in early November, when the surface is smooth and dark, reflecting the bare trees. It was completely silent. I think that's what I want most. Silence. A silence that isn't the absence of sound, but the presence of peace. Margot wrote back. She complained about having to drive the old truck to work because her father couldn't spare the gas for her new car. It was such a normal complaint. It felt like a message smuggled from a different planet. I read that letter 3 times. I put the journal down on my knee. The kerosene lamp flickered, casting long, wavering shadows across the rows of cots. The sleep story pacing of the diary, full of observation rather than action, was strangely calming. It spoke of the waiting, the anticipation that defined so much of the soldier's experience long before the actual fighting began. I rose and did another round. Checked Private Johnson's dressing. He was sleeping peacefully now, his fever finally broken. Tucked the blanket tighter around Sergeant Dale, who shivered even in the warm air. Finally, I returned to Private Miller. His breathing was still shallow, even. I wondered if, even in his deep sleep, he sensed the proximity of his secrets. I picked up the journal again, needing the connection back to a simpler time, away from the grime and the constant dull ache of wartime medicine. April 5th, 1944. We saw the sea today. Massive ships stretching further than I could imagine. Everyone is talking about the invasion. The date changes hourly, the rumors multiply like bacteria. I spent the evening cleaning my rifle. It feels heavy in my hands, a tool designed for one singular, terrible purpose. I keep thinking about what Dad told me before I left. He said, "Tom, just remember to look up. Don't spend your whole life looking down at your boots. Look up and see the sky." I realize I've spent the last 3 weeks looking exclusively at my boots. I need to find the sky again, even if it's an English sky. I realized I didn't know much about Thomas Miller, the boy who wrote this. He was quiet, reflective, not the typical brash young soldier we sometimes saw arrive full of bravado. He seemed to carry the weight of the war in his mind long before his body bore the scars. The war effort was a machine, a grinding, relentless thing that turned boys into soldiers and sometimes, tragically, into statistics. But reading this diary, I was reminded that every statistic began as a person who missed cinnamon and worried about car problems. I had hours yet before the morning shift took over. I turned another page, settling deeper into the quiet narration. May 2nd, 1944. The waiting is the worst enemy. It breeds doubt and fear. We are camped in a field full of buttercups. The irony isn't lost on me. We are preparing for the largest military action in human history while surrounded by tiny, yellow, perfect flowers. I wrote Margot a long letter today, but I didn't mention the buttercups. I didn't mention the constant, low-grade thrum of anxiety that lives beneath my ribs. I wrote about the nice tea we had in the village and how the air smells cleaner here than it ever did in Ohio. Lies, mostly, but necessary ones. She doesn't need my fear. She needs my hope. I saw Sergeant Dale crying behind the mess hall. He's older, maybe 30. He looked embarrassed when he saw me, but I pretended I hadn't noticed. We don't talk about the fear. It's a silent currency we all deal in. I stopped, the name catching my attention. Sergeant Dale. Was that the same Sergeant Dale sleeping 3 cots down? The one I had just tucked in? It was a common name, certainly. But the thought sent a small shiver down my back. These men, brought together by chance and conflict, were all linked in ways we couldn't see from the outside. This diary was pulling me further into Private Miller's past and simultaneously pulling his past right into my present. The distance between the writer and the patient was collapsing. I spent the next 2 hours simply reading. The entries became shorter, more fragmented as the promised date of the invasion neared. The prose turned almost journalistic, noting logistical details more than feelings. It was the sound of a mind tightening, preparing for the inevitable shock. June 3rd, 1944. We're moving. Late tonight. They gave us hard rations and told us to write our last letters. I wrote Margot. It felt final. I told her I loved her and that I would be thinking of the lake. I didn't mention the guns or the sea or the fact that my hands are shaking so badly I can barely hold the pen. I simply said goodbye. I didn't say see you later. I said goodbye. That feels important. The dates suddenly skipped. The next entry was 2 weeks later, and the handwriting was different, hasty, almost illegible. The war had finally arrived in his journal. But even here, the rules held firm. There were no descriptions of combat, no gore, no graphic scenes. Thomas Miller, the sensitive diarist, censored himself, even for his own eyes. June 17th, 1944. Somewhere near the hedgerows, judging by the smudge marks. The noise, it's a physical thing. It punches you in the gut and steals your breath. I saw things today that, well, I won't write them here. I won't give them permanence. They can stay trapped in the dark corner of my memory. We stopped near a shattered orchard. The air smells like wet earth and burning metal. Sergeant Dale, the one who cried he's gone. Not gone, but transferred, thankfully. A minor injury. I envy him the minor injury. It's the little escapes that count. I found a rose bush still blooming amongst the rubble of a stone wall. One perfect, velvety red bloom. I kept moving. The beauty felt like an insult. I looked up again. Private Miller was still resting. The idea that he had witnessed terrible things he couldn't even commit to paper, weighed heavily. He was so young to be carrying that kind of silence. This was the core of my task here, wasn't it? Not just patching bodies, but trying to return these fragmented minds back to the men who owned them. I closed the journal, placing it carefully on the knit stand beside the cot. I needed to get up, walk the ward, and check vitals. The air was getting colder as the early morning hours approached. I ran through my mental checklist: dressings changed, fluids administered, temperature stable. All the small, meticulous tasks that kept the chaotic energy of the war at bay. When I returned to my little corner, the silence was thicker than before. I picked up the diary again, pulled by that unignorable whisper. I needed to understand what brought him to this bombed-out schoolhouse. July 5th, 1944. Stuck. Completely stuck. The days blur into weeks. We were just waiting for orders. The villagers here are strangely resilient. I saw an old woman sweeping the dust from her doorway, even though her roof was gone. Life insists on carrying on, even when it's been fundamentally broken. I keep rereading Margot's letters, the ones where she talks about the garden. She always wanted peonies. I promised her when I come home, I'll plant the most magnificent peony garden the state of Ohio has ever seen. It's a silly dream, a small, domestic thing, but holding on to it feels vital. That promise is my anchor. If I lose the promise of the peonies, I think I might lose myself. This was the true Thomas Miller, not the tired soldier, but the boy with the dirt-stained hands and the grand, fragile promise of a peony garden. I decided to write down the name Margot in my own small notebook. If he woke up, knowing the names that mattered to him would be a huge comfort. He was alone here, hundreds of miles from his life, and she was the last thread. I checked his chart again, Private Thomas Miller, no next of kin listed nearby. Just the standard forms. The rest of the night passed in a slow, sleep-friendly haze of low light and soft movements. I would check a patient, record the numbers, and then return to the steady, comforting presence of the journal. July 18th, 1944. We moved today through what used to be a very nice town. Now it's just chimneys and ghosts. The quiet after the shelling stops is the loudest part. It screams everything that has been lost. I saw a young lieutenant sketching. He was drawing a portrait of a farmer and his small dog, oblivious to the fact that the entire farm was gone. It made me realize that drawing or writing or simply remembering is an act of resistance. It's proof that the war hasn't taken absolutely everything. My hands feel rough. The skin is permanently dry and cracked. I remember Margot saying once that I had the softest hands she'd ever touched. I laugh now, a short, dusty sound. My hands are soldiers' hands now, but I still have the pencil, and I still have the hope of the peonies. The story inside the journal continued to unfold, a slow, detailed account of the soldier's internal landscape. He wrote about the taste of the canned beans, the coldness of the night ground, the endless need for coffee. These details, small and ordinary, formed a protective wall around the unspeakable realities he encountered daily. The physical act of reading the diary became intertwined with my routine of care. I would clean his wounds, thinking of the cracked hands he wrote about. I would adjust his fore, remembering the dreams of the lake. I wasn't just treating a set of injuries. I was caring for Thomas Miller, the boy who promised peonies. August 1st, 1944. We're moving east. I had a close call today. Too close. The kind of moment where the world goes silent and then comes roaring back. It makes you think about things you usually avoid, like what happens next, and whether Margot will truly understand. I think the hardest part of surviving is the guilt. Why me and not the others? It's a question that has no satisfying answer. I tried to talk to Corporal Jones about it, but he just shrugged and said, "It's luck. Tom, don't look a gift horse in the mouth." But it doesn't feel like luck. It feels like debt. A huge, impossible debt owed to the silence. I wish I could tell Margot I'm okay, but I can't write this feeling down. It would terrify her. So I wrote about the nice rain shower we had, and the fact that my boots are finally dry. Small comforts, massive lies. I could almost feel the moral weight pressing down on him. War demands impossible sacrifices, not just physical, but ethical. The struggle to maintain sanity and humanity in the face of mechanized brutality was a constant battle that Thomas Miller fought on these stained pages. I flipped through the middle section. It was mostly blank, a testament to the fact that during heavy action, men don't have the time or the mental space for reflection. The exhaustion of pure survival had silenced the writer. September 10th, 1944. We haven't slept well in days. We are in a small village, waiting for the bridge to be secured. I found a piano in a deserted house. The front panel was blown off, and half the keys were broken, but the deep bass notes still worked. I sat there for 20 minutes, just hitting the lowest C key over and over. It was a deep, resonant hum. The sound felt real, grounded, not like the thin, piercing sounds of the conflict. I need that sound again, that low, comforting hum. It reminds me that structure still exists, that the world is not just sharp edges and noise. The depth of his need for simple structure resonated deeply with me. That's what we tried to provide here in the ward, a structure of clean sheets, predictable medication schedules, and the regular, steady voice of a nurse. A temporary barrier against the unpredictable nature of war. Private Miller's condition remained static. He was sleeping off the trauma. His body was rebuilding, hidden behind the curtain of unconsciousness. The silence gave me the time I needed to read his whole story. I continued reading through the long, quiet shift. The atmosphere in the schoolhouse was strangely heavy that night. There was a fog outside, blurring the distant lights of the supply trucks into hazy halos. September 28th, 1944. We are now in the real danger. The air is thick with anticipation, the kind of static electricity that makes the hair stand up on your arms. I saw a letter today from a man named Corporal Jennings. He was writing to his wife about his daughter's 3rd birthday. It was so heartbreakingly ordinary. I put it in the mailbag. I hope she gets it. I hope he makes it home to her. I realized today that the war hasn't changed what I want, just made it sharper. I want Margot, the peonies, and the smooth, dark water of the lake in November. Nothing more elaborate, just quiet safety. That's the only victory I'm fighting for now. This was the mission statement of his heart. His entire existence distilled down to 3 sensory, peaceful images. It was a profound articulation of what the war tried and often failed to take away from these men. I found myself becoming protective of him. This silent boy in the cot was now an established character in my mind. I knew his fears, his hopes, and his promise to Margot. I reached the final available entries. They were written in a hurried scrawl, clearly under duress, suggesting he was very close to the location where he was found, a place that was actively collapsing under fire. October 12th, 1944. The noise is constant. We have been running for 3 days. Running, stopping, shooting, running again. We passed an abandoned schoolhouse. It looked so solid from the outside, but inside, the central hall was just rubble. I thought about the children who used to learn there. The thought felt like a tiny sliver of ice in my chest. I saw a photo today, just a scrap of a picture of a blonde girl, maybe 6 years old. It was lying in the dust near the wall. I picked it up. She was smiling. I tucked it into my pocket. It feels like a talisman, something to protect. October 15th, 1944. We are taking cover. The artillery is fierce. I can hear the cracks of the collapsing structure around us. I don't know how much longer this position will hold. I keep thinking about the peonies. I need to make it back to plant those peonies. I need to see the lake when the water is dark and smooth. I have to get this book safe. If I don't make it, someone needs to know that I tried. Someone needs to know about Margot and the peonies. I found a small, tight space behind a section of stone. If the roof comes down, maybe this will survive. I am tired, so deeply, overwhelmingly tired. I am going to wait it out here. If I close my eyes, I can almost smell the cinnamon. That was the last full entry. I stared at the page, my breath catching in my throat. He had written this, his last coherent thoughts, in the very structure where I found him. He had purposefully hidden the journal, understanding the risk, prioritizing the safe passage of his secrets over everything else. He was the writer trapped inside the story. I looked down at the physical location where the diary was found, just a few feet away, behind a makeshift canvas screen. He must have been injured moments after writing that, or perhaps while trying to wedge the book into the debris. I turned the page. There were only a few more lines, scratched in charcoal or a burnt stick, almost illegible, done in the deep, chaotic darkness that must have followed the impact. October 16th, just a number, need Margot. The promise, not. The charcoal trailed off into a heavy, greasy smudge. That was it. The end of the published story. The rest of the book was empty or destroyed. I closed the journal. The cover was still warm from being held in my hands for so long. I felt an overwhelming sense of connection to this man, this private Thomas Miller who had entrusted his deepest, most human self to the pages I held. I knew the truth of his soul. I knew he was fighting for a garden, not for glory. The weight of knowing was heavy. What right did I have to this intimacy? When he woke up, he would be a stranger to me, but I would know his soulmate's name, his father's advice, and his desperate, beautiful dream of peonies. The sun began to rise, a pale, hesitant light filtering through the broken windows of the schoolhouse. The morning routine was beginning. Low voices, the clank of basins, the hurried, quiet footsteps of the other nurses. I placed the journal back on the small table beside him. It looked small and insignificant next to the 4-pole and the monitor. I began my final morning checks before the doctor arrived. I checked Thomas Miller's pulse, stronger than yesterday. I refreshed the cool compress on his forehead. As I stepped back, I noticed a slight flicker. His eyelashes moved, then a barely audible sound escaped his lips. It was a low, weak murmur. I leaned in closer, my heart pounding a steady, nervous rhythm. Was this it? Was the real Thomas Miller about to return to the chaos? He murmured again, the sound clearer this time, definitely a name. But it wasn't Margot. It was a different name, a name I hadn't read in the diary. Lily, he whispered, the sound raw and fragile. I straightened up slowly, feeling a cold wave of confusion wash over me. Lily. Who was Lily? He stirred again, shifting his bandaged shoulder, settling back into sleep. But the name hung in the damp air. I looked at the scorched cover of the journal. The entire book was dedicated to Margot, the cinnamon, the lake, the peonies, all Margot. But the last word, the word whispered in the vulnerable borderland between trauma and consciousness, was Lily. I had read his secrets, but perhaps I hadn't read the whole story. Perhaps the diary held the past and Lily was the present. Or perhaps the diary itself was a carefully curated lie, designed to protect someone or something. The doctor walked into the ward, his boots scuffing the dusty floor. The moment of reflection was over. I stared at the scorched cover, wondering which story was the true one. I realized I would soon have to give him back his secrets, and I would have to live with the secret of knowing. I reached out, just touching the burned edges of the cover, knowing that the questions contained within that book and the man beside it were far from answered. The return of the journal to its owner was imminent, and with it, the confrontation between the life he wrote about and the life he was waking up to. This was only the beginning. The light continued to grow, transforming the sharp shadows into softer, more manageable gray areas. I moved away from Miller's cot, but my focus remained tethered to him and the small, damaged book. The sudden appearance of Lily felt like a structural collapse in the narrative I had, painstakingly constructed over the long night. I moved to the supply closet, pulling out fresh linen, my mind still replaying the diary entries. Every word about Margot felt sincere, deeply felt. The commitment to the peony garden was not a throwaway line. It was his stated reason for survival. It was his promise. If Margot was his anchor, who was Lily? A sister? A distant cousin? A nurse he knew from the transport? Or something much more complicated? Something that had arisen during the blank, terrifying months between the last entry and his arrival here? The atmosphere of the schoolhouse always magnified feelings. The high cracked ceilings seemed to hold the echoes of past lessons and current pain. I thought about the children who might have sat here learning arithmetic or geography. Did they ever imagine this place, their sanctuary of learning, would become a clearinghouse for human suffering? Now, the only lessons taught here were resilience and the grim arithmetic of survival rates. I busied myself with preparing morning medications. Each vial and syringe was a small victory against the chaos outside. The war outside was defined by noise and destruction, but our world here was defined by meticulous order and quiet desperation. This dichotomy, the silent, ordered work against the backdrop of global violence, was the most profound element of our existence. I considered talking to the head nurse, Mrs. Davison, about the journal. She was pragmatic and usually gave sensible advice. But how could I explain the depth of my intrusion? I read his deepest fears, Mrs. Davison, and now I know he's lying to his sweetheart, or perhaps lying to himself. The words felt ridiculous even in my own mind. The intimacy of the diary was too personal to share. It was my secret now, as much as it was Thomas Miller's. I looked back at Thomas. His face, pale and smooth in the growing light, held no secrets now. His eyelids were still. He was the vessel, and the journal was the key. I picked up the book again. I rubbed my thumb over the scorch marks. It felt like holding a fragile, captured bird. I wondered what Thomas would say when he realized I had read it. Would he be angry, embarrassed? Or would he be relieved that someone finally knew the full scope of his internal battle, even the part he couldn't write down? I walked the perimeter of the ward, checking the makeshift windows. The fog was starting to lift, revealing the skeletal remains of the adjacent buildings. We were in a small French town, though we rarely used names for security. It was just the schoolhouse, a temporary waypoint on the long, hard road home. I recalled one of his earlier entries. He wrote about the desire for silence, for peace that wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of peace. I looked at the ward full of sleeping men. This was the closest we could get to that ideal. A temporary, medically induced peace. I remembered the peonies. I tried to picture Margot. Was she blonde like the girl in the picture fragment he found? Was she waiting faithfully by the post box in Ohio, utterly unaware of the shell-shocked soldier who fought for her garden? And how would the revelation of Lily impact that carefully constructed promise? The tension in the ward began to rise slightly as the official shift change approached. Nurse Peterson arrived, her uniform crisp, bringing the smell of fresh air from outside. "How's Private Miller?" she asked softly. "Stable," I replied, my voice low. Still resting, the trauma was significant. "I think he's turning the corner, though." He murmured something a moment ago. "That's good," she said, checking his forebag. "Hope he wakes up before they need the cot. We have 3 more coming in from the river action." The constant pressure for space and turnover was always present. It reminded me that Private Miller's quiet recovery was a luxury in this brutal environment. I kept my hand near the journal. I needed to decide when to give it back. When he was fully conscious? Before he spoke? Or perhaps I should wait until the moment he was able to ask for his belongings, to give him the dignity of initiating the conversation. I thought about the structure of his mind, revealed through his writings. He was a man who planned, a man who built promises. The act of writing the diary was an act of architectural self-preservation. He built a quiet, safe space in his mind where the buttercups and the peonies could survive the explosions. And now I was the sole witness to the potential flaw in that structure, the presence of Lily. I realized the greatest danger wasn't that he would find out I read the book, but that I knew the truth before he was ready to face it himself. I was holding his internal conflict fully formed in my hands. I picked up a stray piece of charcoal from the floor near the cot, likely what he used for his last desperate scrawl. It left a black smudge on my fingers. The war was messy, even in its quiet corners. The more I thought about Margot, the more real she became. I imagined her waiting by the postbox, perhaps checking the calendar, wondering if Thomas was safe. The diary was her connection to him, too. If he had died in that rubble, the journal would have been the last comprehensive record of his sacrifice and his love. I gently placed the journal onto his chest, just resting the scorched cover on the blanket. This was his property, his life. I had borrowed his privacy, and now it needed to be returned. I stayed close as the morning light intensified. The doctor completed his rounds, noting the improvement in Miller's vitals. Keep him quiet, good hydration. We'll reassess by evening. As the doctor moved on, Private Miller shifted slightly again. His hand, which had been resting limp at his side, twitched. Then slowly, with immense effort, his fingers curled, ever so slightly, toward the small book resting on his chest. He was reaching for his secret, even while deeply unconscious. The realization hit me. He wasn't just clutching the air when we found him. He was trying to protect the book, to ensure his written story survived. I removed the book just as his hand grazed the blanket. Not yet. Not until he was fully awake and could recognize the responsibility of his own words. I held the journal firmly, feeling the textured cloth. It was heavy with implied narrative, thick with the unwritten chapters. If I were to give him the book now, I would be handing him the most profound contradiction of his young life. The conflict between Margot, the hope of the future, and Lily, the fragile, whispered truth. I tucked the journal securely back into my pocket. My shift was officially over, but I couldn't leave. I needed to see him open his eyes. I needed to see which face he would put on, the face of the loving fiancé, or the face of the wounded man who had other secrets. The entire room, once quiet and still, felt charged with potential energy. The calm, sleep story-friendly pacing of the past night was accelerating, inching toward the moment of revelation. I watched Thomas Miller, the soldier I knew better than anyone else in the world, yet who remained a complete stranger. The morning noise of the ward, the distant roar of a jeep, the low chatter of nurses, all of it faded. There was only Thomas, his secrets, and the imminent moment of his awakening. I decided to clean his immediate area, a way to keep my hands busy while my mind raced. I tidied the bedside table. I moved the used bandages. I noticed a small photograph tucked beneath the edge of the mattress. It must have slipped out when we moved him. It was a small, creased photograph. Not the scrap of the blonde girl he mentioned in the diary, but a photo of a woman. She was lovely, smiling, with dark hair tied back with a ribbon. On the back, written in elegant script, were 2 words, always Margot. I placed the photo next to the journal in my pocket, feeling a surge of relief. The core of the diary was true. The love for Margot was real. But then, who was Lily? The contradiction settled back in, heavier than before. The diary was a testament to love and survival. The whispered name was a mystery. I looked back at Thomas Miller. He stirred again. This time, his eyes fluttered, resisting the deep sleep. He was coming back. The transition from the silent world of the unconscious to the chaotic reality of the bombed-out schoolhouse was beginning. I took a deep breath, preparing my face to be calm and professional. I was ready to greet Private Thomas Miller, the soldier. But I knew I would be greeting Thomas Miller, the poet, the man who dreamed of peonies. The man who whispered the name Lily, his eyes opened. They were a clear, startling blue. He blinked slowly, taking in the cracked ceiling, the white canvas screens, the haze of dust. His gaze finally settled on me. A slow, puzzled frown crossed his face. He tried to speak, but only a dry cough escaped. "It's all right, Private," I said softly, leaning closer. "You're safe. You're in a medical ward." "I'm Nurse Collins." His lips moved again. He was searching for words, for recognition. And then he spoke, his voice thin and shaky. He wasn't asking where he was or what happened. He was asking about something infinitely more important. The book, he rasped. Did anyone find my book?" I looked into his clear blue eyes, eyes that now held the memory of the orchard, the fear of the crossing point, and the exhaustion of the long struggle. "Yes, Private," I said, keeping my voice level, professional, and calm. "It's safe. It's right here. I've been holding on to it, you. It's time I gave it back." I reached into my pocket, slowly pulling out the scorched, battered journal. The leather cover, stiff from the fire and the damp earth, felt rough against my palm. As I lifted it, the book seemed to absorb the weak morning light, radiating the sheer weight of its contents. Thomas Miller's eyes, still watery and confused, fixed on the journal with an intensity that surprised me. It wasn't the look of a man recognizing property. It was the look of a man recognizing his own survival. I placed the book gently onto his chest, right where I had found it. He made a small, hitching sound in his throat, a mix of relief and pain, and his fingers, thin and pale beneath the blanket, immediately fluttered toward it. He didn't try to lift it, he wasn't strong enough yet, but he rested his fingertips lightly on the edge. "Thank you, Nurse Collins," he whispered, his voice catching on the words. I thought I lost it. "You were protecting it pretty fiercely," I observed, moving to adjust the drainage tube beside his bed. I kept my face turned away, concentrating on the machinery, giving him a moment of privacy, even though I knew the deepest details contained within the pages he was touching. The intimacy of the past night felt like a physical heat rising on my neck. "It's important," he managed, closing his eyes briefly as a wave of fatigue washed over him. "I know," I said simply. And I did know. I knew it held the promise of the peonies, the memory of cinnamon, and the terrifying weight of his experiences. I used the quiet moments of his initial awakening to observe the physical damage. His injuries were serious but clean. We had managed to stop the infections that were so common in this environment. He was alive and he was coherent. Two facts that felt like miracles in this bombed-out shell of a building. The morning routine continued around us, a constant, low-grade buzz of activity. The other nurses, including Nurse Peterson, were attending to the new arrivals. The sounds of boots on the dusty floor, the rattle of a supply cart, the low murmur of professional instructions, all created a fragile shield of normalcy. I had finished my shift, but I couldn't walk away. I pulled a wooden stool closer to his cot. "I need to ask you a few questions, Private Miller, just standard procedure," I said, picking up his chart. "Do you know today's date? Do you know where you are?" He furrowed his brow, concentrating hard. "It's late October." "The 16th? No, later. A field hospital. Somewhere in France." "That's excellent, Thomas." "It's October 21st. You've been with us for a few days. You're in a former schoolhouse, now Ward C." He paused, looking at the book on his chest. He still hadn't tried to open it. He seemed content just to feel its presence. "My memory is a little hazy," he admitted, his voice gaining a bit of strength. "The last thing I remember was the sound, the noise, and trying to find a safe place for the book." "You were very lucky," I responded truthfully. "We found you beneath the rubble of what must have been the staircase." "The rubble," he repeated, looking around at the cracked walls, seeing the evidence of the school's destruction all around him. He must have recognized the location where he had secreted his book and written his last thoughts moments before the collapse. I waited, adjusting the pillows behind his head. He was quiet for a long time, the only sound his steady, shallow breathing. He seemed to be conducting an inventory of his own body and mind, a slow, meticulous calculation of the damage. "Nurse Collins," he finally said, his gaze distant. "The little picture. Did you happen to find a small photo? A scrap of one?" My heart gave a sharp, unexpected jump. He was asking about the second secret, the one he had tucked away and forgotten. "I found this," I said, gently pulling Margot's photo from my pocket, the one labeled "Always, Margot." I handed it to him. He took the photo, his hands trembling slightly, and pressed it against the cover of the journal. A genuine, profound sense of relief washed over his features. "Margot," he breathed, a warmth entering his eyes that hadn't been there moments before. She's everything." The confirmation of his love for Margot was immediate and undeniable. But this only deepened the central, silent mystery. If Margot was everything, why the urgent, whispered appeal for Lily? I watched him hold the photo, letting the silence extend, knowing that this quiet time was crucial for his recovery. "I imagine she's waiting anxiously for news," I offered gently. He nodded, rubbing his thumb over the creases in the small photograph. "We had an understanding. We were going to plant peonies when I got back. The biggest garden in Ohio. It sounds silly now, but..." "It doesn't sound silly at all, Thomas," I interrupted, genuinely. "It sounds like a very important goal." He gave me a weak, grateful smile. He didn't question how I knew about the peonies. I felt the dangerous intimacy of my knowledge growing. The next few days were characterized by a slow, meticulous rebuilding of his strength. The focus shifted from basic survival to active recovery. Thomas was quiet, reflective, much like the voice in his journal. He rarely spoke unless spoken to, but when he did, he asked about the small things, the weather outside, the status of the other men, and whether the water drip from the broken gutter had stopped. He kept the journal constantly near him, usually beneath his thin pillow. He would occasionally pull it out when he thought I wasn't looking, open the cover, and simply stare at the first page, the one dated March 14th, 1944. He never seemed to read the later entries. It was 2 nights later, during the late shift, that the question of Lily returned with full force. The ward was settled into its deepest phase of sleep. The kerosene lamp cast long, stable shadows. Thomas was awake, staring at the ceiling. I was administering a late-night sedative to another patient when I heard Thomas whisper, louder this time, "Lily, wait." I rushed to his bedside. His eyes were wide but unfocused, a look of profound, silent panic gripping his features. He was clearly having a waking nightmare, a reliving of the moment of his injury. Thomas, look at me. You're safe. You're here in Ward C," I murmured, placing a cool hand gently on his forehead. He flinched slightly, but the terror in his eyes slowly receded as he focused on my face. "I'm sorry, Nurse Collins," he muttered, ashamed. "I didn't mean to wake anyone. You didn't, but you were calling a name." "Lily," I said, deciding in that moment that honesty, or at least partial honesty, was the only way through this. "Who's Lily, Thomas?" He closed his eyes again, a muscle twitching in his jaw. The silence that followed was heavy, the kind of silence he had described in the journal, the kind that wasn't the absence of noise, but the loud presence of what was lost. She's not Margot," he finally said, his voice flat. "Lily is the debt." The word debt struck me immediately. I remembered the entry from August 1st, 1944, where he pondered the guilt of survival, calling it a huge, impossible debt owed to the silence. I knew then that Lily was not a romantic rival. Lily was the human cost of the war he couldn't escape. "Tell me about the debt, Thomas," I prompted, keeping my voice soft and non-judgmental. He hesitated, reaching for the journal under his pillow, pulling it onto his lap. He didn't open it. He just held it like a shield. I wrote Margot about the buttercups. I wrote about the dry boots. I wrote about the promise of the peonies. He began, his breathing becoming shallow as he relived the memories. The journal, that was the promise. It was the good I carried, the future. And Lily? I asked. Lily was the past that collapsed, he said, staring at the scarred walls of the schoolhouse. Do you remember I wrote about finding a picture? A scrap of a blonde girl? October 12th, 1944. Yes, you said it was a talisman. Something to protect. We were moving through that ruined town that day. The one I wrote about, mostly just chimneys and ghosts. We stopped near a small house that had been completely leveled, except for one short section of stone wall. And under the rubble, I heard a sound. A whimper. He paused, swallowing hard, his eyes filling with an unshent sorrow. It was a little girl, maybe 6 years old, just like the girl in the picture. Her name was Lily. She was pinned under a beam. She was terrified, but she wasn't crying, just making that tiny sound. Her mother was gone. We had orders. We had to move. The position was compromised. Sergeant Dale, the one who cried, he was shouting at me to keep moving. He said we couldn't stop. The whole operation depended on getting to the crossing point. He clutched the journal tightly. I tried Nurse Collins. I tried to pull the beam off her. She was so small. She had bright red ribbons in her hair, but I couldn't move it. And the shelling started again, fierce, right on top of us. His breathing grew ragged. I placed my hand on his arm, a steady pressure urging him to breathe, to slow down. I had to make a choice, Thomas whispered, the confession tearing at him. Save the mission or save Lily? I told her I would come back. I told her to hold tight. I ran. I kept running until I reached the schoolhouse, the crossing point. I was injured just moments after I finished writing the last entry, October 15th. That whole area collapsed. I never made it back to her. He was silent now, the quiet room amplifying the weight of his admission. Lily wasn't my love, Nurse Collins. She was the one I abandoned, the debt I owe. Margot is the reason I survived. Lily is the reason I almost didn't want to survive. I finally understood the profound complexity of the journal. It was the edited version of Thomas Miller, the one he presented to himself and to Margot, the hopeful soldier fighting for a future garden. But the whispered name in his fevered sleep was the raw, unedited truth, the guilt, the horror, the unavoidable sacrifices the war demanded. You said in your journal that the hardest part of surviving is the guilt. Why me and not the others? I reminded him gently. Lily is that why me, isn't she? He nodded, tears finally tracking slow, dusty paths down his cheeks. The book was supposed to be proof that I was a good man, that I fought for the right reasons. But in my dreams, the part of me that is just pure honesty, the part that doesn't care about the peonies, only cares about the red ribbons. And she keeps whispering, wait. I sat there for a long time, just letting him process the release of this terrible secret. My role as nurse had completely shifted. I was no longer just the caretaker of his body. I was the unwilling confessor of his moral injuries. Thomas, I said, you were a soldier following orders under fire. You made a choice that was impossible. You cannot carry the weight of the entire conflict on your shoulders. You cannot plant a garden if you don't survive to hold the shovel. But I promised her, he insisted, looking down at the journal. I promised I would come back, and you tried to save your soul in this book. I countered, tapping the scorched cover. You tried to keep the hope alive. That is also an act of resistance, Thomas. You wrote that writing and remembering is proof that the war hasn't taken absolutely everything. If you let Lily consume you, the war wins. You need Margot and the peonies now, more than ever. He stared at the journal again, then slowly, tentatively, he opened it to the last page. He didn't look at the charcoal scrawl, "Need Margot," the promise not, that passed it to the blank pages. The pages where the rest of his life needed to be written. "The book isn't finished," he observed, his voice quiet. "No," I agreed. "The next chapter is planting the peonies." The conversation established a new, silent contract between us. I knew his secrets, and now he knew that I knew. The professional distance was gone, replaced by a quiet, shared understanding that was necessary for his recovery. He still needed physical healing, but more importantly, he needed psychological repair. The next 10 days in Ward C were marked by an almost agonizing slow return to the world. Thomas Miller, now that he had externalized his moral injury, was able to focus on the basics of healing. I kept a steady presence nearby, often sitting on the stool, reading the supply manifests or my own letters from home. We didn't talk much, but the atmosphere was lighter. I frequently reflected on the structure of his experience, as revealed in the diary. I thought about the entry from March 20th, 1944, when he longed for the silence that wasn't the absence of sound, but the presence of peace. He was finally beginning to experience that peace here, in the organized quiet of the ward. The silence was medically enforced, yes, but it was still a silence that offered safety. I remembered his father's advice he noted on April 5th, 1944. "Don't spend your whole life looking down at your boots. Look up and see the sky." Thomas had been looking down at the rubble, consumed by the detail of the immediate fight and the weight of Lily. Now, he was starting to look up at the cracked yet open ceiling of the schoolhouse. As his strength increased, he started to write. Not in the old journal, which he kept safely wrapped in a handkerchief, but in a fresh, clean notebook I gave him. His handwriting was shaky at first, reflecting the trauma in his arm and shoulder, but it gained consistency. He didn't write about the war. He wrote about the garden. He was planning the specific dimensions of the flower beds, the type of soil, and the exact varieties of peonies Margot loved Peel, Carl Rosenfield, Sarah Bernhardt. He was building the future, stroke by careful stroke. One afternoon, he looked up from his new journal and handed me a page. "I need your opinion, Nurse Collins," he said, smiling weakly. "Do you think Margot would prefer a white picket fence, or just a simple stone border around the path?" "Stone," I advised immediately. "It's timeless, and it requires less upkeep. You'll want to spend your time admiring the blooms, not painting the fence." He laughed, a genuine short burst of sound that was healthy and warm. It was the first time I had heard him truly laugh. It was a sound that proved the hope he had documented on September 28th, 1944, the small, domestic things he was fighting for was winning. I knew that Thomas would soon be transferred to a larger hospital, away from the front lines, and then eventually back home. My role was nearing its end. I needed to ensure that his two journals, the record of his pain and the blueprint for his future, were secured for his long journey. We spoke one last time about Lily. "Do you think she survived, Thomas?" I asked him late one night. He took a long pause. He didn't look tormented, just resigned. "I don't know. The village was completely destroyed, but I think I have to believe she survived. I have to believe that my sacrifice leaving her to complete the mission meant something. If I go home and live the life Margot and I planned, that will be the only way I can honor the small picture, the talisman I carried. I have to live for the peonies, for Margot, and for Lily. They are all linked now." He was achieving the peace he had longed for. Not the quiet of the grave, but the internal quiet of acceptance. The understanding that perfection was impossible in war, and that survival was its own complicated form of victory. He was integrating the guilt, Lily, into the promise, Margot, making his life whole again. The day of his transfer arrived quickly. It was a bright, cold morning, the fog finally broken by a sharp autumnal sun. Thomas was dressed in fresh, clean uniform parts, borrowed from the supply depot. He looked frail, but standing tall, a soldier, not a patient. He was carrying his small kit bag, and tucked inside, I knew, were both journals and Margot's photograph. He stood by his cot, waiting for the transport vehicle. The usual chaotic energy of a departure was muted for him. He seemed focused, ready to leave the shell of the schoolhouse behind. "I need to say something, Nurse Collins," he said, turning to face me. I braced myself. "I know you read the book," he said gently, confirming my long-held fear. "I knew it when you asked about the peonies. Only Margot or someone who read the book would know how important those tiny domestic things were. And frankly, only someone who read the last entry would have searched for and found Margot's photo." I felt the blood rush to my cheeks. "Thomas, I am truly sorry. It was highly unethical. But when I found you, you were so weak, and I needed to know who you were beyond the tag on your neck. I needed the context." He waved a hand dismissively. "Don't apologize, nurse. You didn't violate my privacy. You saved my life. You knew about the debt before I could even say the name. You gave me permission to talk about Lily, which I couldn't do, not even on paper. You made my secret manageable. The journal was an edited hope. You forced me to confront the whole truth." He reached into his bag and pulled out the original scorched journal. The one dated from March 14th, 1944 to October 16th, 1944. "This story is finished," he said, handing it to me. "I want you to keep it, Nurse Collins, until the war is over. Keep it as proof. Proof that the things we write down, the promise of cinnamon and silence and peonies, are the things that bring us home. And as proof of Lily, that she wasn't forgotten." I took the book, its familiar weight resting in my hands. The cover was still burned, the pages torn, but now it felt less like a captured secret and more like a sacred artifact. "I will safeguard it, Thomas," I promised, my voice thick with unexpected emotion. "Good," he said, picking up his bag. "Now I have another journal to write, the Journal of the Garden." He gave me a final, steady nod and headed out the door, moving toward the waiting ambulance. I watched him go, a small, recovering figure walking toward the sun. He was going home. He was carrying his past, Lily, the debt, and his future, Margot, the peonies. The man who walked out was whole, despite the terrible scars. I stayed in the ward long after the ambulance sounds faded into the distance. The sun was fully up now, casting bright, hard light onto the chalk-dusted floor. I walked back to his empty cot, smoothing the linen and folding the blanket. Ward C was busy again, already receiving new arrivals. The flow of men, injured and disoriented, was constant. The schoolhouse was simply a rotating doorway, facilitating the brutal transition from the battlefield back to life. I sat down on the empty stool next to Thomas Miller's former bed, holding his journal. I ran my fingers over the scorched spine. The entire experience had shifted my understanding of my own role. I wasn't just patching up tissue and bone. I was guarding the fragile internal lives of these men. Thomas had taught me that the biggest wounds weren't always visible on the surface. They were the moral injuries, the psychological debts that men incurred when they had to choose between survival and humanity. I realized that the journal, now in my possession, was not just Thomas's story. It was an artifact of the entire war effort, the intimate, unedited testimony that lay beneath the grand political narratives. It was the reason why the war was fought, for small, fragile dreams that insisted on surviving the surrounding destruction. I thought about the immense comfort he found in the deep bass note of the broken piano, described in the September 10th, 1944 entry. That grounding sound that reminded him that structure still existed. That was what the hospital tried to be, a deep, resonant hum of order against the chaos. I tucked the journal securely into my locker beside my own sparse belongings. It would stay there, safe and silent, until the war was finally, truly over, and I could send it back to Thomas Miller in Ohio, where he would be planning the dimensions of his magnificent peony garden with Margot. The word was calling. A new patient needed attention. The cycle of caring, of witnessing, and of holding on to the fragile hopes of others continued. I stood up, adjusting my uniform. I looked at the cracked ceiling, letting the weak autumn light wash over me. I wasn't looking down at my boots anymore. I was looking up toward the vast, indifferent, but still beautiful sky. And in my heart, I knew that Thomas was safe, writing his new chapters, planting his future, honoring his debt, and finally finding the true presence of peace.